The stars are not just distant suns. They are the future we've lost, the memory of those who dared to reach for them, and the hope that we might one day find ourselves among them again. Elara stood at the edge of the old observation deck, gazing at the burning sky. It was not the sky of her youth, full of hope, full of stars. Now it was the sky of a dying earth, clouds thick with ash, the air a constant reminder of the planet's impending collapse. The last few years had been a countdown to nothing but emptiness. Once she had been a dreamer, a scientist obsessed with the stars and what lay beyond. She had grown up hearing stories of humanity's great leap, of space exploration, and of finding new worlds. But now, at the age of 34, those dreams seemed so far out of reach, like another life entirely. But Elara still believed in the impossible. The Earth was dying. Its resources were gone, its ecosystems shattered, its people divided. The remnants of human civilization had one final hope, one final chance to escape the inevitable. A black hole, discovered on the edges of known space, could hold the key to a new home, a new beginning. But it was dangerous, unpredictable, and untested. No one had ever returned from the event horizon. And yet, Elara had been chosen to lead the mission, a final, desperate attempt to save humanity, and perhaps herself, from a world they had failed to protect. Her heart still ached with the memory of her family, the ones who hadn't made it, her brother, her mother, the world they had all once known fading away like a dying star. She would not let them die in vain. Elara's mission began not with a bang, but with a hum. A quiet, constant whir of machinery in the sterile control room, the soft buzz of voices discussing the final preparations, the small mechanical sounds of a ship that had been built for a journey no one could predict. Elara had spent countless hours in the shadows of this mission, planning, calculating, testing, and retesting every possible outcome of this unthinkable voyage. She had become a ghost in the corners of the project, ignored by the press, her voice drowned out by the political noise that followed such a monumental endeavor. She was not a leader of men or a celebrity scientist like those before her. She was simply a woman driven by grief and hope, a woman who had learned long ago that the pursuit of knowledge often led to suffering, but suffering too could lead to redemption. "Ready, Elara?" Kael's voice interrupted her thoughts. She glanced over at him. Kael, the mission's pilot. He was as different from her as night and day, where she was quiet and introspective. He was brash and forward, confident in his abilities, but haunted by his own past. A man who had seen the worst of humanity and the universe, and yet remained steadfast in his duty. Elara nodded, her face unreadable. "Ready?" Kael didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press. They both knew that this moment would come, that the mission would begin, and that there was no going back once they crossed the threshold into the unknown. She followed him out into the docking bay where the ship, Ecliptic, stood waiting. It was a sleek, angular vessel, equipped with technology that had been crafted to endure the unimaginable, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien technology. The ship was the result of decades of research, resources, and collaborations between the last remaining space agencies. Yet, despite its advanced design, it still felt like a fragile thing, a mere speck in the vastness of space. Elara's eyes lingered on the ship's hull. It was a beautiful thing, but it was also a coffin, a symbol of humanity's last hope. Inside, the crew was gathered, their faces tense but resolute. They were a team of the best minds, but most of them were strangers to one another. There were no friendships, no bonds forged in the fire of battle or camaraderie. There was no room for that in a mission like this. They were each a cog in the machine, each one tasked with their part in the race against time. Elara took her seat, strapping herself in, her fingers hovering over the controls, her mind spinning with thoughts of what lay ahead. There were no guarantees, no promises that they would succeed. The black hole could just as easily consume them as it could offer them salvation. Yet this was the only chance they had. "Coordinates locked," Kael said as he powered up the systems. "Last chance to back out." Elara gave him a small, knowing smile. "We're not backing out, Kael." Kael's smile was tight. "I didn't think you were the type." "None of us are," she replied quietly. As the countdown began, Elara's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of humanity's survival rested on their shoulders, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a nagging sensation in the back of her mind, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp, or a warning she didn't fully understand. "This is it," she thought. "The moment where everything changes." And then the voice came, a voice that wasn't her own. "Elara, you still have time." She froze. The voice was clear, unbidden, as though something was speaking directly into her mind. Her breath caught in her throat. What was that? But before she could ask, Kael's voice broke through the silence. "Engines at full power. We're ready for departure." Elara blinked, trying to clear her thoughts. She couldn't afford distractions now, not when they were so close to their goal. "Initiating launch," she said, her voice steady, even though her mind was reeling. She reached forward, pressing the button that would send them hurtling toward the unknown. The ship shuddered, the hum of the engines intensifying as they began to move. For a moment, it felt like they were traveling through water, the resistance palpable, like they were being pulled toward something greater, something unavoidable. The stars outside the windows began to shift and warp, bending and twisting in ways that defied understanding. The black hole loomed ahead, its vastness swallowing everything in its path. This was the beginning of the end. The journey had begun. The familiar hum of the ecliptic was both soothing and unsettling, a constant reminder that they were leaving everything behind. Earth was a distant memory now, receding like a dream that fades when you wake. Even the stars, once so full of promise, seemed to flicker faintly in the distance, like 1,000 lost souls. Elara sat in the cockpit beside Kael, eyes fixed on the view screen. The blue marble of Earth had long disappeared, replaced by the endless blackness of space. Behind them, a trail of light, like a comet's tail, marked their path as they left the solar system behind. "How long until we reach the event horizon?" Kael asked, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of nervous energy. "Approximately 24 hours, Elara replied, her gaze never wavering from the vast void ahead. "If all goes according to plan." "If..." Kael shot her a quick glance, raising an eyebrow. Elara's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're traveling into uncharted space, Kael. There's no such thing as a plan when you're dealing with a singularity. But I'm confident in our calculations." Confidence, that was the word. A word she had tried to hold on to since the moment they first stepped into this vessel. Confidence that this mission was not just a chance, but humanity's final chance. But beneath that confidence, there was a gnawing doubt, one she couldn't shake no matter how many times she told herself everything would be fine. "Everything will be fine," she whispered to herself, but the words were not comforting. They sounded hollow, like an echo from a place she could no longer reach. Behind them, the crew of the Ecliptic moved about, each absorbed in their work. The science officers, technicians, and engineers were locked in their stations, monitoring data, adjusting settings, and keeping the ship in optimal condition. It was a well-oiled machine, a team of specialists who had trained for this moment. For years, they all had their part to play, and yet, as the ship pressed deeper into the unknown, a sense of unease hung in the air, unspoken but ever present. Elara's fingers brushed the console in front of her, tracing the worn metal edges. It was the one thing she could focus on, a way to ground herself. In the silence of the cockpit, her thoughts wandered. Did my family ever really believe in me? She wondered. Did they think I was capable of this? Her mother had always been the voice of reason, the one who taught her that science was about finding answers, no matter the cost. Her father had been the dreamer, the one who spoke of possibilities beyond the stars. And her brother, he had been her heart, the one who shared in her vision, who believed in the impossible. But they were gone now, all of them, lost to the ravages of a dying Earth, lost to the unrelenting march of time that no human could escape. I can still make it right, Elara thought fiercely, gripping the edge of her seat. I can bring us to a new home. I can save humanity. A sudden jolt interrupted her thoughts. Kael cursed under his breath as the ship rocked violently. Red warning lights flashed across the cockpit and alarms screamed. What the hell was that? Kael snapped, his hands flying across the controls as he fought to stabilize the ship. Elara's heart raced. We've passed the outer gravitational field of the black hole. It's pulling us in faster than anticipated. The ship is reacting to the distortion in space-time. We're being dragged in already? Kael's eyes were wide. I thought we had more time. We do, Elara said, her voice sharp, but the field's more powerful than we expected. Hold on. The ship groaned as the engines fired, desperately trying to counter the immense gravitational forces. Outside, the stars had begun to twist, bending and warping, their lights stretched and distorted. The black hole itself loomed closer, its immense gravity pulling at them with an invisible hand. Initiating emergency protocols, Elara shouted, her fingers moving with practiced speed. She called up the trajectory calculations, recalculating the path to adjust for the unexpected force. But the numbers were changing too fast. It wasn't enough. The ship was spiraling toward the event horizon at an accelerating rate. We need to pull back. Kael's voice cracked with urgency. We can't, Elara replied, eyes wide with realization. Once we're this close, there's no going back. The singularity's gravity is already too strong. The ship lurched again, and Elara had to grip the console to keep from being thrown out of her seat. The lights flickered as the systems fought to stay operational, and the constant hum of machinery grew louder, more frantic. What happens if we go too far in? Kael asked, his face pale. Elara's mind raced as she processed the calculations in her head. Once we cross the event horizon, time becomes relative. We won't be able to communicate with anyone outside the black hole, and depending on the size of the singularity, we could be stretched, torn apart at the atomic level. Worst case scenario, we're lost forever. Kael swallowed hard. And best case, we find another universe, another galaxy, something that can sustain human life. But even then, we won't know what we'll encounter. We'll be in uncharted space, isolated for who knows how long. A tense silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the sounds of the ship's desperate struggle against the forces pulling them in. Look, Kael suddenly shouted, pointing at the view screen. Elara turned. The black hole was right there now, so close it filled the entire screen. It was not the pitch-black void she had expected. Instead, it shimmered with strange, iridescent colors, pinks, blues, and violets swirling in chaotic patterns, as though the fabric of space-time itself were being torn apart. And inside that churning chaos, Elara saw something else, a faint glowing shape. Is that something inside the black hole? She murmured. Kael's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know, but it looks alive. Before Elara could respond, the ship's systems gave a final mechanical cry of distress. The lights blinked out, plunging them into darkness. Only the dim, eerie glow of the black hole illuminated their faces. And then the ship was gone, hurtling toward the singularities. Hot. The ship lurched violently, throwing Elara and Kael against their harnesses as the ecliptic was consumed by the black hole. The gravitational forces were unlike anything they had experienced, bending and twisting the fabric of space around them. For a moment, there was nothing but the violent, otherworldly noise of the ship's hull screaming under the strain, the hum of alarms, and the flashing red lights that filled the cockpit. Elara fought to steady her breathing, eyes fixed on the view screen as the black hole stretched outward, filling the window with a kaleidoscope of colors she could not comprehend. Pinks, purples, and electric blues swirled in impossible patterns, like some cosmic tornado pulling them deeper into its heart. "Hold on!" Kael shouted over the cacophony. His fingers flew across the console, desperately trying to regain control, but the ship wasn't responding. The gravity from the singularity had already reached a point where even their powerful engines couldn't fight it. Outside, the stars were disappearing. Space itself was bending, curving around them. The last fragments of the universe they knew were vanishing, leaving only an all-encompassing void. Elara. Kael's voice was tight, strained. "I don't think we're going to make it." Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew the risks. They all did. But seeing the black hole now, feeling the crushing pull of its gravity, was something else entirely. It wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the fear of being erased from existence. No time, no space, no memory, just a void. But they had to try. They had to. There was no turning back now. Humanity's future was on the line. "Kael," Elara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We have to keep going. We don't know what's on the other side. We've got a chance. I can feel it." The words felt hollow even as she said them. The truth was, she had no idea what awaited them. All the calculations, all the theoretical models, they were based on speculation, on assumptions. No one had ever ventured this far before. There was no roadmap, no safety net. Just a leap of faith. Suddenly the ship jolted once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't the pull of gravity alone. Something else was happening. A strange electric energy filled the air, as if the very atmosphere around them was alive, reacting to their presence. "We're being pulled by something," Kael murmured, eyes wide with disbelief. "Not just the black hole. Something else is in there." Elara's fingers trembled as she adjusted the controls, trying to compensate for the new forces acting on the ship. The view outside had become distorted. Time and space were no longer linear. The stars were smeared like paint in water, and the black hole itself seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm. This can't be right," Elara said, her voice barely audible. And then, something impossible happened. A massive surge of light exploded in front of them, blinding them for a moment. It was unlike any light they had ever seen, a mix of iridescent blues and silvers that danced like living flames. The ship's hull groaned under the intensity of the energy field, and Elara instinctively gripped the armrest, bracing for impact. When her vision cleared, she saw something that took her breath away. A massive floating structure appeared before them, suspended in the black hole's swirling depths. It was made of what looked like a crystalline material, its surface shimmering with an unnatural glow. The structure was alien, far beyond anything human technology had ever conceived. It was massive, incomprehensible in scale, and yet perfectly symmetrical, as if designed with intention. Elara's mind raced. What is that? Is that a station? Kael's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile reality around them. "I don't know," Elara replied, her eyes fixed on the structure. "But we need to find out." Before they could make a decision, the ship was drawn toward it with terrifying force. They were helpless as the gravitational pull of the black hole and the energy field around the structure worked together to draw the ecliptic in. Kael fought the controls, But it was no use. They were being sucked into the unknown. "We have to. Make it inside. We have no choice," Elara shouted, her heart racing. With the last of the ship's power, Kael guided the vessel toward an open docking bay on the structure's surface, the ship's engines screaming in protest as they approached. The bay doors were large, almost too large, as if waiting for them. The ship crashed through the threshold, the force of the impact reverberating through every inch of the ecliptic. The ship came to a sudden jarring stop, sending Elara and Kael lurching forward in their seats. The lights flickered, and for a moment everything was still. Silence. "Are we alive?" Kael muttered, rubbing his head as he looked around, as if expecting to see the wreckage of their ship. "We're alive," Elara said, exhaling slowly as she unstrapped herself. "But barely." She turned to the view screen. Beyond the ship's hull, the docking bay was vast, far more than a simple airlock or station bay. It was a cavernous space, filled with alien machinery that hummed with a strange energy. The walls were lined with glowing symbols, an unrecognizable language etched into the surface, pulsing with a life of their own. "This is not just a station," Elara whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's something more, something ancient." They were inside the heart of the black hole now, beyond the event horizon. There was no way to know if they had crossed into another dimension or parallel universe. The laws of physics had bent so far that the rules of reality no longer applied. But one thing was certain, they weren't alone. "Let's get out of here," Kael said, his voice a little too tight, a little too strained, "before whatever built this thing decides it doesn't like us." Elara nodded, but her mind was racing. The ship had been brought here for a reason, and this was no ordinary black hole. It was a gateway, a portal to something beyond their understanding. She could feel it in her bones, the energy, the presence. It was ancient, powerful, and it was watching them. They needed answers. They needed to understand what had brought them here, but first they needed to survive. The ship's landing was rough, but somehow they had survived. Elara and Kael stood at the threshold of the ecliptic, staring into the alien docking bay. Their breaths were shallow, every instinct screaming for caution. The cavernous space before them was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't just the scale that was overwhelming. It was the sense of ancient, forgotten power that pulsed from every corner of the vast chamber. It was as if the very walls were alive, watching them. The ship's engines hummed quietly behind them, still sputtering from the shock of the crash. Outside, the structure seemed to go on forever, stretching beyond the limits of their vision, its strange, crystalline surface reflecting the eerie glow of an unknown energy source. Alien symbols danced across the walls in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the very air. "Where are we?" Kael's voice broke the silence, his gaze fixed on the massive, organic-like structures around them. He was visibly unnerved, his usual bravado replaced by the raw edge of someone who didn't know whether to fight or run. "I don't know," Elara replied, her voice almost lost in the vastness of the chamber. "But we need to figure it out. We don't have much time." There was a nervous edge to her words. The ship's systems were down, and while they were temporarily safe inside the structure, they had no idea what lay beyond the bay doors. Every step they took could bring them closer to something dangerous. But they had no choice. The black hole had consumed them, and now they had to find a way to survive, or find a way home, if that was even possible. Kael moved toward the control panel near the ship's airlock, his hands flying over the interface in a flurry of rapid gestures. His face was drawn tight with concentration. No signal, no communication, no backup. We're completely cut off from the rest of the universe. We're on our own. Elara joined him, her heart sinking as she studied the control panel. The technology was alien, impossibly advanced, but some of it was still recognizable. It had a certain symmetry to it, a design that suggested intelligence, but the interface was incomprehensible to her. "Maybe we can find a way to repair the ship," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. Repairing the ecliptic seemed like a distant, unreachable goal. They had crashed into this unknown structure without any idea of what was coming next. The black hole had already twisted their fate beyond recognition. Could they really fix their ship, escape, and return to Earth? "No," Kael replied, his voice sharp. "First, we need to find out what this place is, and who or what built it." Elara didn't argue. She knew they had to explore. They couldn't stay in the ship forever. Something deep inside her was telling her that they had come here for a reason. They were meant to find this place, even if they didn't understand why. And maybe, just maybe, it held the answers to saving humanity, or at least to answering the question of what lay beyond the black hole. With a final glance at the ship, Elara stepped away from the airlock and Kael followed, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the chamber. They moved cautiously, their senses heightened, every sound amplified in the stillness. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, vibrating softly as though they were alive. The air felt thick, charged and heavy, with an unnatural presence. Farther they walked, the more the structure began to change. What had initially appeared to be a sterile mechanical environment slowly morphed into something else. The crystalline surfaces became jagged and rough, as though they had been worn down by centuries or millennia of erosion. The alien symbols on the walls shifted, their glowing patterns moving like liquid, their meanings forever out of reach. "Elara," Kael said suddenly, his voice low. "Do you feel that?" She stopped and closed her eyes for a moment, reaching out with her senses. The air was different now, thicker, colder. It felt as if the very space around them was warping. She nodded. "I feel it. It's like we're not alone." Kael's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his waist, though Elara knew that it would offer little protection in this alien environment. "This place doesn't feel right." Before Elara could respond, a low hum filled the air, resonating from the walls themselves. It was a sound unlike anything they had heard before, neither mechanical nor organic, but a strange mix of both. It reverberated through their bones, making the hairs on the back of Elara's neck stand on end. The ground beneath their feet trembled, faint at first, but then with increasing intensity. The whole structure seemed to come alive, vibrating in time with the hum, as though it were awakening after a long slumber, "I don't like this," Kael muttered, taking a step back, his eyes darting around the room. "We need to get out of here, now." "Elara," a voice whispered, low, distant, and impossibly clear in her mind. Elara froze. The voice wasn't Kael's. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was as though the words were being spoken directly into her consciousness, bypassing her ears entirely. Her pulse quickened. "Did you hear that?" Kael turned, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "Elara." The voice whispered again, this time clearer, more urgent. "You have time, but not much. You need to leave now." Her blood ran cold. The words weren't just a warning, they were a command. "Elara, are you all right?" Kael asked, his voice growing concerned. The voice faded, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Elara's heart was pounding in her chest. She knew she had heard it, but who or what had spoken to her? "We have to go," Elara said abruptly, her voice tight. "Something's wrong. We need to leave this place before it's too late." Kael hesitated, but then nodded. The urgency in her voice was enough to push him into motion. Together, they turned and began to move toward the exit, but before they could reach the threshold, a new sound filled the air. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the chamber, and the floor beneath them buckled. The walls shimmered, And for a brief moment, Elara thought she saw a flicker of something, someone, standing just beyond the light. A figure, tall, humanoid, and silhouetted against the pulsating glow of the structure's core. Before she could react, the figure vanished, swallowed by the shadows. "Elara," Kael began, but then his voice faltered as the floor buckled again, sending a wave of panic surging through both of them. "Elara, we need to move, now!" Kael shouted, his voice edged with fear. Elara didn't need to be told twice. She broke into a run, her mind racing. Whatever had spoken to her, whatever this place was, it wasn't safe. The warning was clear now. They had been lured here, but for what purpose? To witness their destruction. And why had the figure appeared, then vanished? The deeper they went, the more questions they had, and the closer they came to understanding the terrifying truth. The air inside the structure had grown heavier with each passing minute, thick with an oppressive energy that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. Elara could feel it in her chest, the weight of something ancient and all-consuming pressing down on her as she walked. It wasn't just the gravity of the black hole anymore. It was something else entirely, something aware. Kael was close behind her, his breath ragged, his every step hesitant. It wasn't like him to show fear, but the fear was there, barely concealed under his usual bravado. The weight of the unknown was beginning to crack his resolve. "This place is alive," he muttered, his voice rough, as if trying to rationalize what they were experiencing. "I don't know how, but it is. I can feel it too." Elara didn't answer. She couldn't. The words felt hollow in her mouth, too weak for the gravity of what they had discovered. Instead, she kept moving, her eyes scanning their surroundings, her senses on high alert. She had to stay focused. They had to find out what this place was, and more importantly, what had drawn them here. The corridor they were following twisted and turned, its walls shifting as though the structure itself was responding to their movements. The alien symbols were now fully alive, pulsing with rhythmic energy that resonated in the air, vibrating through their bones. It wasn't just a decoration anymore, it was a language, a code. But no matter how hard she tried to decipher it, Elara felt as though she were only scratching the surface of its meaning. A sharp crack of sound echoed through the chamber, and Elara stiffened, her instincts flaring. She wasn't sure whether it was the structure itself shifting or something, or someone moving within it, but the noise had an urgency to it that sent a chill down her spine. "Elara," Kael said suddenly, his voice low but firm. "Look." He was pointing toward a dimly lit alcove ahead of them, just off the main corridor. The shadows gathered there thick and dark, as though the space itself were hiding something. There was a flicker in the air, like static electricity crackling in a storm. Something was moving within the darkness, something that wasn't just a part of the structure. A faint glow appeared within the alcove, outlining a shape, slender, humanoid, but not quite human. Elara's heart skipped a beat. It was the figure from before, the one she had seen vanish in the shadows earlier. This time, though, it was fully visible. The figure stepped forward, revealing itself in the light. It was tall, its body elongated and gaunt, with skin that shimmered like liquid metal. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark voids, empty and infinite, like the black hole itself. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffused with an ancient cold intelligence that chilled Elara to her core. It didn't speak at first. Instead, it seemed to watch them, studying them, with a gaze that went far beyond mere observation. It was as though it could see into their very souls, unraveling the deepest fears and desires within them. Elara felt the weight of its gaze and instinctively stepped back, her heart hammering. "What is it?" she whispered, barely able to find her voice. Kael reached for his sidearm, but his hand faltered, unsure. He wasn't afraid of much, but this was beyond anything they had encountered before. The creature raised one long, slender arm, and the air around them seemed to pulse with energy. There was no sound, no movement, but Elara felt it, a pressure in her mind, a sense that the creature was trying to communicate, not with words, but with intent. The symbols on the walls began to shift again, this time forming coherent patterns. The language was complex, but Elara could almost hear it now, whispering to her in her mind, urging her to listen. "You have crossed the threshold," the voice echoed. But it wasn't coming from the creature. It was the same voice Elara had heard before, the one that had warned her. But now it was clearer, more distinct. "You have crossed the threshold, and now you must choose." The words resonated in her mind, sending shivers down her spine. Elara staggered back, her mind racing to process the gravity of what she was hearing. "Choose?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "Choose what?" The creature did not respond. Instead, it stepped aside, motioning for them to move forward. "Elara," Kael whispered, his hand still gripping the sidearm, though his body was stiff with uncertainty. "What is this place, and what does it want from us?" Elara swallowed hard. She didn't have answers. All she had were questions. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary alien race, no lost civilization. What they had stumbled upon was something far older, far more powerful. And now they were in its grasp. "This is a place of judgment," Elara said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a thought, it wasn't a theory. It was a feeling, something deep within her, something instinctual. This place is ancient, and it's not just a station. It's a test. Kael frowned. "A test?" Elara nodded slowly, her mind racing. "Yes, a test, a trial, for us, for humanity. Whatever lives here, whatever built this place, it has been waiting for something or someone to cross into its domain." She took a step forward, eyes fixed on the creature. "We weren't just pulled here by the black hole. We were chosen." The creature didn't react to her words, but the tension in the air grew heavier. A hum began to vibrate again, deeper this time, filling their chest cavities as if trying to force them to understand. It wasn't just the creature's presence anymore, it was the entire structure. It was alive, breathing with them, moving with them. They were at the center of something monumental. "Elara, you have to stop. You don't know what you're saying." Kael's voice was strained, panic creeping in. This thing isn't human. It's not like anything we've seen before. Whatever it is, it could be dangerous." Elara turned to face him, her expression hardening. "I know what it is, Kael. I know what we're facing. And I know we don't have a choice." The creature raised its arm again, and the walls around them began to shift once more, forming a gateway ahead. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, the energy building, and then, suddenly, the structure seemed to open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The air was thick with a new, raw energy, one that pulled at Elara like gravity itself. She felt it in her chest, in her mind. The choice was here. It wasn't just a test of survival. It was a test of humanity's worth. The creature motioned again, its intent clear. "Enter." Elara exchanged a brief, uncertain glance with Kael. He didn't have to say it. She could see it in his eyes. He knew what they had to do. This was a pivotal moment, a crossroads, and they were the ones chosen to stand at the center of it. With a final deep breath, Elara stepped forward. "I'll go first," she said, her voice steady, determined, and she entered the chamber, Kael close behind her, both of them unaware of the trial that awaited them in the heart of darkness. The air in the vast chamber was thick, vibrating with energy that seemed to press in from all sides. Elara's breath caught as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the space. The walls were smooth, a crystalline material that seemed to pulse, with light shifting in hue with each beat of the invisible force that surrounded them. It was as if the entire chamber was alive, responding to their presence. Behind her, Kael was silent, his hand still hovering over the sidearm at his waist, but his posture was rigid with tension. They had crossed the threshold of the trial, and there was no turning back now. Whatever waited for them on the other side of this chamber would determine not only their fate, but possibly humanity's as well. "Elara," Kael whispered, his voice low and strained. "What do you think this is?" Elara swallowed, her mind racing. The energy in the room felt like it was alive, like it could reach into her thoughts and pull out her deepest fears, her most hidden desires. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just an alien trial. This was something much older, much more profound. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming weight of the moment. "But we're here for a reason, Kael. We have to see this through. We have to finish this." The creature had led them here, had guided them into this chamber with a silent command. And as Elara looked around, she saw no exits, no way out. The only direction was forward. The floor beneath their feet was smooth, almost slick, and as they moved deeper into the chamber, the walls around them began to shift. Slowly at first, then faster. The symbols that had once appeared as abstract, patterns now aligned in perfect sequences, forming coherent flowing shapes. It was as if the entire structure was communicating with them, telling them something they couldn't fully grasp. Elara stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding. The room felt as though it were bending around her, the air growing heavier with each passing moment. And then the hum, low at first, barely perceptible, began to rise. A voice, ancient and distant, echoed through the chamber, reverberating in Elara's skull. It was the same voice she had heard earlier, the one that had warned her. The one that had told her she was chosen. "You have entered the heart of the trial," the voice intoned, its tone deep and resonant, as though it was speaking from the very core of the universe itself. "Now, you must prove your worth. Your decision will determine the fate of all you know. Will you succeed or fail?" Elara's stomach churned. The words weren't just a warning, they were a challenge, and the implications were clear. They had been brought here for a reason, and that reason was not just to survive. It was to make a choice that would affect the future of humanity itself. Kael clenched his fists at his sides, his gaze shifting nervously between Elara and the pulsating walls. "What does it mean? Prove our worth? How do we even begin to—" The voice cut through the air again, this time more urgent. "You are not here to understand. You are here to act. Your actions will decide your destiny." As the voice faded, the chamber around them seemed to shift. The walls rippled like water, and the floor beneath their feet trembled. A dark fissure appeared before them, a deep chasm that seemed to drop into the very heart of the structure. "Elara," Kael said, his voice a mixture of fear and awe. This isn't just a test. It's a choice. We have to choose." Elara didn't respond at first. She was too busy watching the chasm before them, feeling the energy that was building in the room. The fissure stretched wide, far wider than anything natural should have been. There was a pull to it, a gravitational force that tugged at her, just as though it were calling her, asking her to step forward. "Choose what?" Elara whispered, half to herself. But the question hung in the air, unanswered. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a trial of strength or wit. This was a trial of sacrifice. With a sudden flash of light, the walls of the chamber dissolved into a series of floating holographic images. It was as if the structure itself was showing them what could happen if they failed. The images played out before them. Earth covered in ash, its skies thick with smoke, the oceans boiling, and cities reduced to rubble. It was a vision of the future, one where humanity had lost its way. Elara's breath caught in her throat. This was not just a possible future, it was a warning. If they failed this trial, this would be their reality, the destruction of everything they had fought for. Kael, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is it, the choice we make here. It could save or destroy everything. Destroy. The images shifted, showing another future, one where humanity had evolved beyond its current limitations. There were glimpses of peaceful cities, of harmony with nature, of a future where they had conquered the stars and brought an end to war and suffering. It was a vision of hope, of what could be if they succeeded in this trial, but the choice wasn't clear. Both futures were possible, and yet Elara knew instinctively that the wrong choice could mean their complete and utter annihilation. Kael looked at her, his face a mask of confusion and fear. How are we supposed to choose? We don't even know what's on the other side of that chasm. What if it's not what we think it is? Elara didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing, analyzing every possibility. She thought about humanity's past, about the mistakes they had made, the wars, the greed, the destruction. She thought about their potential, the potential they had to rebuild, to evolve, to rise above their past. But there was no certainty. There was no right answer. Elara, whatever we do, we have to decide now, Kael urged. If we don't, the choice might be taken from us. Elara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The chasm before them was not just a physical divide, it was a symbolic one. It represented the path humanity could take, the one they could create if they chose wisely. The fissure in the ground pulsed with an ominous light, growing brighter, urging them to act. And as she stood there, staring at the swirling depths of the chasm, Elara realized something. This wasn't just about saving humanity. It was about choosing what kind of future they wanted to create. They could save the world, or they could destroy it. With a final, resolute breath, Elara stepped toward the edge of the chasm. I don't know if this is the right choice, she said, her voice trembling but steady. But we can't let fear hold us back. We've come this far. We have to trust that we can make the right decision. She looked back at Kael, his face full of doubt, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. He stepped forward, joining her at the edge. Together, they looked down into the abyss, and together they took the final step into the unknown. The chasm before them was an endless void. Its depth seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the chamber, a blackness so deep it threatened to consume everything. Elara felt her heart race as she stood at the edge, the pull of the abyss, growing stronger with every passing second. She could sense the weight of the choice she had to make. The trial was not about physical strength or intellect, it was about their hearts, their spirits, and the very future of humanity. Kael stood beside her, his expression grim, but there was a certain quiet resolve in his eyes now. They had come so far, and the path was clear, yet still the fear of the unknown gripped him, just as it did her. Elara, he said, his voice low, do you think we can really make a difference? After everything we've seen, everything we've been through, how can we possibly know what's right? Elara turned to him, her eyes filled with the weight of what they had experienced. The images, the choices, the warnings, they had all led them here. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. I don't know, Kael, she said quietly, but what I do know is that we've been given this choice. No one else can make it for us. Not humanity, not the alien species that built this place, only us. And we have to trust ourselves. We have to believe that we can shape the future. Kael's lips pressed together in a thin line. The stakes are too high. If we fail, if we choose wrong, everything could be lost. We can't be paralyzed by fear. Elara said, her voice firm. "This is about taking responsibility for ourselves, for the world we're leaving behind. If we don't choose, we're choosing nothing at all, and that's the biggest failure of all." For a long moment they stood in silence, staring into the abyss. The weight of the decision threatened to crush them, yet Elara could feel something stirring inside her. The knowledge that they were at the crossroads of destiny, that everything had led them to this point, was both terrifying and exhilarating. Then, as though reacting to their thoughts, the chamber began to shift. The ground beneath their feet hummed with a deep vibration, and the walls around them flickered with the alien symbols once again. This time, they weren't just glowing. They were moving, swirling in patterns that seemed to convey meaning. Urging them forward, "Elara," Kael said, his voice suddenly trembling. "Look!" The void before them pulsed with light, and then, emerging from the darkness, a figure appeared. It was the same creature that had guided them through the structure, but now it seemed different. The metallic sheen of its body was gone, replaced with a translucent, almost ethereal form that radiated with a soft, shimmering glow. It spoke, but this time it did not use the voice that had echoed in their minds before. It was a deep, resonant sound that filled the chamber, emanating not from the creature's body, but from the very heart of the structure itself. "The trial is complete. Your decision awaits." Elara felt a shiver run down her spine. The creature's gaze, though alien, was filled with an ancient wisdom. It wasn't just judging them, it was waiting for them to choose, to make the final move. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, and in that instant, everything seemed to slow down. She could feel the presence of the black hole pulling at her, as though time itself were bending, stretching, and in that moment, she understood. The trial had never been about surviving the structure or solving puzzles. It had been about understanding, choice, understanding what it meant to be human. Humanity doesn't need to be perfect, Elara whispered to herself. It doesn't need to be free of mistakes. What it needs is the courage to grow, to evolve, to learn from its past. She turned to Kael, her voice clear, unwavering. "This is our chance. A chance for humanity to rise above its worst tendencies, to forge a new future. We can't undo the mistakes we've made, but we can choose to change, and that change begins with us." Kael looked at her, his face softening. "You're right. We can't keep repeating the same mistakes. We can be better." Together, they turned toward the creature, the chasm before them still dark and endless. But now, there was a light in the distance, a faint glow emerging from the darkness, beckoning them forward. Elara reached out, her hand trembling as she moved closer to the edge. The future, like the abyss, was vast and uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, to take the leap. Without a word, Kael joined her, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. They shared a brief glance, one that held years, of unspoken understanding between them. They had been through so much, but now they knew the most important thing. Their choice would shape not just their future, but the future of everyone. They were ready to move forward, and with that, they stepped into the abyss, The chamber shimmered, and for a moment the world around them seemed to dissolve into light. A sense of peace washed over Elara, a calm certainty that they had made the right choice. The trial was over. The decision had been made. They were not alone in the darkness, though. The chamber, this ancient, sentient structure, responded. It understood. It had tested them, but in the end it had seen what humanity was capable of. The ability to learn, to change, to rise above their flaws. As they fell into the abyss, they felt no fear, only the exhilarating knowledge that the future, humanity's future, was in their hands now. And as they descended, the world outside, the earth, the stars, seemed to shift, to adjust to their decision. They didn't know what would happen. Next, but they knew that change was already in motion. The black hole was no longer a threat. It was a gateway, a passage into a new beginning, and they were ready to face it.